Chip Kelly, while their team was victorious on Saturday night, most of the news coming from the bowl games played on the opening day of bowl season is actually coming from the postgame press conference from Chip Kelly himself. I've long been an admirer of Chip Kelly. I think he's smart. I think he's cerebral. I think he's been around a long time, and he has seen the game evolve. He's also spent time at the FCS level. He's spent time in the NFL, and he's had not one but two very successful runs in the Pac-12 at both Oregon and at UCLA. So I think he is uniquely positioned to comment on the world of college football. Let's take a listen to what he had to say after the game on Saturday.
I think we need to have a conference commissioner. I think football should be separate from the other sports. Just the fact that our school is leaving to go to the Big Ten in football, our softball team should be playing Arizona in softball. Our basketball team should be playing Arizona in basketball. But because football left, and they're saying, well, how do you do that? Well, Notre Dame's independent in football, and they're in a conference and everything else. I think we should all be independent in football. And you can have a 64-team conference that's in the Power Five, and you can have a 64-team conference in the Group of Five. And we separate it, and we play each other. You can have the West Coast teams, and then every year we play 7 games against the West Coast teams, and then we play the East. So we play Syracuse, Boston College, Pitt, West Virginia, Virginia. Then the next year you play against the South while you still play your 7 teams. You can play a 7-game schedule. You can play 4 against another conference, another division opponent, and you can always play against one Mountain West team every year so that we can still keep those rivalries going. Not that I've really thought about this. Not that I've a lot of spent of time on this. But I think if you went together collectively as a group and said there's 132 teams and we all share the same TV contract, so that the Mountain West doesn't have one and the Sun Belt doesn't have another and SEC has one and they have another, that we all go together, that's a lot of games, and there's a lot of people in the TV world that would go through it. You can sponsor each one. Instead of calling it Group of 5 and Power 5, you can call it Amazon, Nike, bid that out to things. You do a lot of different things. But I think if we still do the same thing and take all that money, and I would do this, and I think this needs to be done, that money now needs to be shared with the student athletes, and there needs to be revenue sharing, and the players should get paid, and you can get rid of NLI, and the schools should be paying the players because the players are what the product is. And the fact that they don't get paid is really the biggest travesty.
So there he is, and you get to listen to pretty much everything he has to say. I think it's thoughtful. I think it makes sense. I think it's easily consumable, and it's been a hot button topic really for the last 48 hours as people have weighed in on what it was that he had to say. Here's what I would say about it. One, we were actually very close to this potentially happening. Prior to realignment, there were some schools that were a little frustrated with their current circumstances. And there was, I think, amongst people that are in the know, there was maybe a little momentum being created for Texas and potentially Oklahoma, USC, and UCLA, those being the 4 first to move. There was a little momentum towards them potentially becoming independent. And then there was the possibility of those 4 schools, along with Notre Dame, to begin recruiting other schools when their grant of rights would ultimately expire. As a result, feels like maybe the conferences got out in front of it and basically slowed down any momentum that could be generated, because it's scary. The conferences and the security that comes with the conferences is the bird in the hand. The possibility of going independent, that's the bird in the bush. It might be beneficial to be independent, but scheduling might become more difficult. You could very easily get locked out. Notre Dame's just fortunate because they have an agreement with the ACC for their scheduling, and they also are a very desirable product. Let's be real. With all due respect to fill-in-the-blank university, not everyone moves the needle like Notre Dame. If Iowa State, for example, were to go independent and maybe put together their own television deal, it wouldn't be anywhere near what Notre Dame's television model would be. No disrespect to Iowa State, it's just the reality of the size and scope of Notre Dame's reach. So independence was a possibility at one point. Now, when we talk about the idea of putting together 64 teams in the P5, 64 teams in the G5, and then you maintain regionality, one thing I would say about that is we're kind of already moving in that direction. I mean, you see 18, 16, 14 teams in specific leagues. That, to me, is already the direction that we're going. And I don't get the sense, at least at this point, I don't get the sense that Tony Petitti in the Big Ten, I don't get the sense that Greg Sankey in the SEC are wanting to relinquish power in favor of the greater good. Why would they? They're already in complete control of some of the biggest brands in the sport. They are going to do whatever it takes for those 14, 16, 18 schools under their umbrella to be as profitable as it may be. I think the biggest point of, I guess, contention, takeaway, discussion that Chip Kelly brought up is whether or not the players should be paid. I totally think that we're moving in that direction as well. Whether it's revenue sharing, collective bargaining, that's going to happen. It's just a matter of whether it happens 2 years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Whenever that day comes, it will happen. But the problem is, and as someone that is a member of the NFLPA, as someone that played professionally, I know that in 2011, when we had a lockout, the players broke immediately. Why? Because the union wasn't very strong. And the NFL owners got exactly what they wanted. That was with millionaires. Imagine doing it with 18 to 22-year-old kids. If you think that those guys are going to be able to collectively bargain against universities, I'm just going to tell you, I don't feel real strongly about that working out real well for the players. I'm just telling you. As someone that lived it, as someone whose career was in some ways defined by it, it won't happen. This is not the NBA PA, where there's only 400 players, 300 players, 200 players, or whatever in the world that are doing what they do. This isn't the NFL, where it's 16 to 1,700 players. We're talking about tens of thousands of players playing college football that are going to collectively bargain. I don't think it's going to work out very well, just being honest. And the other thing I'd say, people say, well, it's not a lot of money. Let's say, for instance, and Josh Pate used this number the other day when he was talking about this as well. He said, what if they paid every player $50,000? Well, over the course of an 85 scholarship players, that would only be, $4 million or so. Sure, yes, that while that's accurate, these guys now are in an event in which if they put their name in the portal, they can leverage and essentially hold out to make as much money as other teams are willing to pay. Is the model broken? Absolutely. Is it going to get fixed? No, because if I were a player, why would I want it to get fixed? Right now, everything about college football is working in favor of the player. There is absolutely nothing that is working in favor of the coach, and there is nothing that is working in favor of the university. The players are in a pay-for-play situation where they can leverage their own school on an annual basis for more money, or in the event in which another place gives them more money, for a new opportunity. If I'm a player, I don't want to collectively bargain. If I'm a player, I don't want anything to change. Because right now I can do whatever I want without anything that could potentially come away from me. Now, is there risk? Sure. There's a possibility that when Kyle McCord leaves a starting role at Ohio State, that he ends up in the portal, and what if nobody takes him? I think it's unlikely, but what if nobody takes him? Or what if his circumstances are nowhere near as good as the pasture that is green, the one that he leaves? That's a possibility, and you run the risk. But at the same time, all the players, I think, for the most part, are benefiting from this. There are several players that are getting paid tons of money. And probably, let's be honest, is the school getting a lot of return? Probably not. But at least they have a chance. If you have a quarterback a la Dylan Gabriel, you have a chance. Doesn't necessarily mean you're going to win the national championship, but you have a chance. So if I'm the players, I don't want anything to change at all whatsoever as far as pay for play right now, because it's certainly working out in your favor. The other part that he discussed is the regionality and how, well, the West Coast schools will play the West Coast schools, and the Southern schools will play the Southern schools, and the East Coast schools will play the East Coast schools, and the Midwest schools, they can play themselves as well. Well, since when is the world fair, or when is the quality equivalent in regionality in sports? We have regionality right now in the Big Ten. And tell me how competitive the Big Ten West has been when compared to the Big Ten East. The answer, it hasn't been. Because regionality doesn't define quality. The most successful schools right now, over the last decade, have been in the southeastern part of the United States. Whether it's Georgia, whether it's Bama, whether it's Florida, whether it's Clemson, those really, for the most part, LSU included, those are the schools that have won the most championships in the last 10 years. Okay? Yes, Ohio State has one in 14, but it's not necessarily equivalent. Yes, there have been representation on the West Coast in the playoff in the past. 2016, Washington. 2014, Oregon. 2023, Washington. There have been some, but it's not the same. So regionality, while important, has not really been an indicator of success. People say, well, why don't we just adopt the NFL model? Well, that would be helpful, perhaps, but that would require a kid from, let's say, Mississippi to basically enter a draft, and he might have to go play for Stanford. Hey, sorry, if we're going to keep things equal and all the divisions need to be equal, then you're from Mississippi. I know you might want to stay at home. You might want to go to Ole Miss, but guess what? You have to go to Stanford because we want to level the playing field. It's not the way it works. Most of the players are going to want to stay at least somewhat close to home. Some will be willing to go elsewhere, but a lot of them will probably go to school in an area of the country in which they're most familiar. And that's why you see more NFL players coming from the SEC, see more NFL players come from the southeastern United States. And while Ohio State can recruit nationally, Michigan can recruit nationally, their rosters are not the same as some of the schools that they also would occupy that Midwestern footprint with. Virginia's roster is not going to be comparable to that of Florida State's. It's just not, or at least it hasn't been at any point in college football's history. So I don't know if regionality, while it's important, I don't know if we need to necessarily start figuring out from a logistics standpoint, hey, yeah, you know what? We need to keep this West Coast teams and the West Coast division. Yeah, they're going to get the same representation in the college football playoff as a team that comes from the state of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. I'm sorry, there's more good, high-quality players that are playing in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, and Alabama than there are in Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and California. Perhaps, just per capita. So I don't think regionality is something that we need to use, but I do think we are full speed ahead towards someday having one college football, I guess you could call it league. And it's going to be the best 64, 60, 55, 50. The most competitive teams will break away. It's going to happen. I can't tell you when, but I would imagine it'll probably be in the next 10 to 15 years. And we will resemble a model that is extremely comparable to what we see in the NFL, to where the NFL is the granddaddy of them all, and you'll have 50 or so, 60 or so, maybe 65, perhaps even 70 schools that are vying for the top prize. And everyone else will be relegated to a division that is lower. It's not fun to talk about. Doesn't make me feel good because there's plenty of G5 teams that I love, but they do not have the resources to compete with the teams that might ultimately start paying their players in an effort to curb some of the behavior that's going on in NIL.